Hi, everyone, and welcome to Be True, my podcast about the writing I love and the writing I do. I can assure you that this week I will not be rhyming the whole time. I'm John Tessitore, and today, the Marsyas section of my long chapbook-length poem, We Are Becoming Unbound. You can find We Are Becoming Unbound and all of my work at johntessitore.com. I record this episode a few days before it's released, as usual, at a time when unrest and tension is spreading across the country, but actual violence appears to be minimal. As you'll hear in what follows, I think that's a very good thing in the end, but I pray that things stay this way, tense, uncomfortable, and fundamentally nonviolent, and that when the police come to remove the protesters from their occupations, the protesters go quietly. That is part of the power of protest, to become a burden on the system, not a threat to individual men and women. So this episode is about principles. It's about the principles of dissent and civil disobedience, something I used to study as an academic. It is not about condoning any acts of physical violence that may take place since I've recorded this episode. In fact, it's about the importance of nonviolence, as I hope will become clear, but also of dissent. And it's ultimately a plea to take protests seriously, and not dismiss them simply because we're conditioned by the media and our politicians to dismiss them. It's a plea with a poem thrown in for punctuation, because these are dark times. You don't need me to tell you that. In fact, that's something we all have in common, I think. I don't know anyone who is happy with the way things are or with the way our future is unfolding. I posted a sketchy faux haiku on my Instagram account last week. It was a quick scrawl, but a pretty close approximation of what I was feeling and what I still believe. Here's what it said. We can all agree that we are all heartbroken, all scared, all worried. It's not a great haiku, but I think it's one of the things we mean when we talk about the human condition. How we're all scared and all worried and all heartbroken all the time. All of us, everywhere in the world, have that much in common. The devil, as always, is in the details. The trouble begins when your fear interferes with my fear, when your worries put you in conflict with my worries, when your heartbreak is deemed more important than mine. When those things happen, we turn mean or superior. We twist our logic to justify our own behaviors and our own blindnesses. We dehumanize each other. Politically, we turn into fascists. Sound familiar? One of the challenges of living in an equitable, peaceful world is setting aside our own fears, sometimes, for the good of the order, or at least acknowledging that our fears aren't the only fears that count, that others are afraid too. Another challenge of living in a civilized world is making the powerful understand the fears, worries, and heartbreaks of the powerless, or, even simpler, of making the powerful respect the shared humanity of the powerless. Power doesn't like to be challenged, and it doesn't like to hear the pleas of its challengers. Power prefers your silence, so it can focus on its own fears, worries, and heartbreak, as well as its own security, status, and profit. And if you let it, power will compel your silence, because it can. That's why the idea of civil disobedience is such an important, globally significant contribution of American culture. Peaceful, nonviolent protest handed down from Thoreau, through Gandhi, to Martin Luther King Jr., and down to the present moment. It's a tool of the powerless. It's the act of confronting and rejecting injustice by using what little you have, usually your own body, to become a nuisance, to make yourself what Thoreau called a counter-friction to stop the machine. Being a bother, being annoying, being ugly, being arrested, being the squeaky wheel, withholding your support, your cooperation, your assent, these are necessary strategies when power tries to silence you from expressing your fears, worries, and heartbreak, and thereby refuses to address the injustice that may have caused your fears, worry, and heartbreak. It's a simple idea, really. Civil disobedience presents each of us with a choice. When we complain that protesters are blocking our path, disrupting our patterns, costing us money, ruining our day, we're choosing our path, our patterns, our money, and our day over theirs. When people ask us to acknowledge and address their fears and we say, "Get out of my way," we've made that choice, which is fair enough. No one likes to be scared or inconvenienced or self-conscious. But when we say, "Get out of my way," we have to accept that we too are now complicit, participants in the regime of power, keeping the little guy down, silencing someone less fortunate than we are. Because annoying us and forcing us to acknowledge the humanity of the powerless, when it's least convenient, is precisely the point of protest. Parents often use cliches like, "There's a time and a place," when they want to scold unruly, disobedient children. But beware of those cliches, from parents and teachers, leaders of any kind, because those cliches are usually the language of power. Let me ask you a question. Is there a right time and a right place to contemplate the death of the innocent in war? Just as an example. Ethically, morally, when lives are on the line, there's really only right here and right now. So civil disobedience asks us a simple question. What property and what social order is worth more than the lives of the innocent? That's what it meant when Thoreau opposed slavery, when Gandhi opposed imperialism, when King opposed segregation, when 4 kids were shot dead in Ohio on the campus of Kent State in 1970. That's what it meant during the Black Lives Matter marches a few years ago. What order and what property is worth the lives of the innocent? What version of the world are you going to choose? And for that reason, in every case, it was imperative that protest be nonviolent, that the protest itself did not create new victims. We're not supposed to like the disruption. It can be ugly, but liking it is beside the point. In fact, it's okay to dislike it. Even the protesters dislike it, as long as you acknowledge that it's an expression of someone's fear and worry and heartbreak, and that it's not all about you. Civil disobedience cuts through all the chatter to show the powerful that the world, the streets, the buildings, the open spaces, the lunch counters, the bathrooms, the water fountains, the buses, are not only for the powerful. Obviously, I've thought a lot about protest and civil disobedience in the last few years. It's an old topic for me. As I said, something I used to study when I was still an academic. I'm hardly a freedom fighter myself. I've been to some protests, I've marched a few times, but nothing to earn me a medal, or even a good war story. But I still believe in the principles. The world is healthier when young people are telling old bastards like me to fuck off. Young people are always the first to die in war, and they're the first to be ignored by the economy. And we're leaving them a pretty shitty world anyway, if we're honest. We really don't deserve their quiet compliance in anything. So, as a scholar, I was always interested in the history of dissent, and today, as a poet, I tend to focus on the issue from a different perspective, from the ideal of our shared humanity and its pitfalls, the idea that we're all heartbroken, all scared, all worried. So let's spin it positively. The opportunity of an equitable, peaceful world is that our talents, our abilities, and our gifts are multiplied. Beauty, knowledge, and love can come from anywhere. And there's an enormous untapped potential trapped in humanity even today, especially today, ready to be unlocked. That's the promise, that the powerless are just as valuable and just as talented and just as wise and innovative as the powerful. Which brings me, finally, and at long last, to today's poem, the Marsyas section of We Are Becoming Unbound. I published this chapbook 2 years ago, and I did not write this section as a comment on civil disobedience. I wrote it as a representation of defiance, self-assertion, even blasphemy. I wrote it as an expression of the self, the expressive, artistic, erotic, heroic self against all odds. But my poems take on new meanings for me over time, and this week I see it differently, as an expression of the self against raw power, the self against the machine. This week I see this poem as the words of an individual who is willing to pay the price for his disobedience. If you don't know, Marsyas was a satyr in Greek mythology, a servant of Dionysus, a man-like being with the ears and tail of a beast. As with all myths, there are several versions of the Marsyas story, but in each he is a wonderful musician who challenges the gods, especially Apollo, by playing his flute, or aulus, in competition. And for his hubris, he is skinned alive. Today, when we say hubris, we often mean an unearned pride and arrogance, especially when it results in the humiliation of the hubristic one. For example, it's often an overreach, an act of hubris that brings down the mighty, like Joe McCarthy trying to take down the U.S. Army during the Red Scare. Overreach, hubris. But Marsyas, the ugly satyr, actually was a godlike musician, a fair rival to Apollo on his lyre. His hubris was not his assertion that he was a great musician, but that he wasn't a god, and therefore had no right to play music as if he were one. Do you hear why I'm drawn to him today? Do you hear the metaphor? The relationship between Marsyas and civil disobedience? Marsyas was silenced simply because he was not a god. He played anyway, and in so doing, he played truth to power, ignoring the consequences to himself. I am wise enough to know I will not win, that I speak too soon, sometimes even to myself. I know a beaten man should not play music when he should be hiding. I know my song is reckless. I know that pun, to hide, is beneath a poet satyr, but still I find every figure of speech as irresistible as an aulos tossed aside, the pleasure of discovering a treasure. I know the best is always overlooked unless you force it to the world's attention. I know that I will be skinned alive, having offered up my nakedness, having shown the gods my talent, all I could show without their kind assistance. And I know that they will want my blood. A creature of the underworld never really has a chance. And so, in the hope that all creatures of the underworld have a chance to be heard someday, on their own terms, without being skinned alive, this is John Tessitore concluding another installment of Be True. If you've listened this long, thank you. You can find all of my work at johntessitore.com. But first, check out Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, originally published in 1849 as Resistance to Civil Government. The problems we face are not new, folks. Special thanks to me for today's theme music, which I call A-Chord. Maybe we'll talk again. And if you enjoyed this little podcast, leave some stars or a review and tell your friends. In the meantime, I gotta feed the dog. All right, Luna, I'm coming.